What urged me to make this video was this picture. Magazines, sites and journalists calling Elden Ring a 10 out of 10, which should be for anyone who played Elden Ring a large warning sign and a signal for you to categorize any of these sites and people as suspicious. While Elden Ring is really good, it's not a 10 out of 10. This is an early review and I feel the need to explain that. I haven't finished Elden Ring yet, and when it comes to these videos I feel honesty is the best approach. I played 50 hours of Elden Ring and when I finish this video, this number will be easily doubled. So I cannot say if it breaks in the late game, but I can judge what I played and what problems I encountered within the game. One problem right here, because that problem will be present in the whole video. Performance. This game lags, and even on the lowest settings, in Elden Ring and OBS, it cannot run stable. Many people also report crashes. I can only hope for your forgiveness in regards to the video quality. What's worse is that Elden Ring doesn't look that good compared to how much resources it takes. I played Dying Light 2 this month and that game runs flawlessly and looks better in terms of graphics. I think it's fair to compare those two games in that regard, because I played both at launch, they have roughly the same number of employees and both are open world. So with that, let's first talk about changes Elden Ring has compared to the Soulsborne games. First is crouching and a dedicated jump button. Crouching in it itself is big, not because of the mechanic but because of the signal it gives. Crouching means that you can evade fights and that it is expected of you. Jumping is necessary for the open world, which is another change. A real open world. You can go practically everywhere from the start. This also changes pacing, because in Dark Souls you had a linear experience. You could take different routes, but that means just choosing which linear path to follow first. In Elden Ring you could go into an advanced area from the start. In recent years, open world games choose different approaches to solve the problem between character progression and area difficulty. The Elder Scrolls has scaling, which means that in all areas stronger enemies appear, which in Oblivion negated any character progression. The Gothic series has set number of enemies that don't respawn, and no scaling. In the recently released Arkulos as well as in many Gothic games, the world gets stronger when you progress in the main story. With each chapter, more enemies and harder ones appear. In Elden Ring there is no scaling to my knowledge. All enemies are as strong as they are and with few exceptions respawn. For me that's the best approach, but that brings a new challenge to the developer. Players could get into way too strong areas or find too strong enemies and not realize it. And I think that's the purpose of the very early boss, Tree Sentinel. This boss is right after the tutorial and way too strong for beginners and many veterans. But you could go anywhere at this point, so many notice the hint and ignore it and then come back later. Oh yeah, I choose Astrologer as a starter class, but somehow do most in melee. My own playstyle is usually a mix of melee, magic and range weapons, which is for me the most fun, and I think in Elden Ring, From Software finally found a way to make magic viable. With that I mean not overpowered. In Dark Souls, enemies were usually helpless against magic. It did way too much damage, and enemies just take it to the face without dodging or blocking. In Elden Ring, enemies react to magic, sometimes in interesting ways. So even if you play with magic, it is fun and a challenge. Some enemies are so fast that magic isn't even an option and I changed to pure melee. And I love this. I like having many options and enemies demanding that I react to them and change my style. That is another change. Elden Ring wants you to have different weapons and utilize items. On the beach you find some slime creatures and Elden Ring gives you a clear tutorial message. It's full screen. How bows work. Melee does nothing to these enemies, and they melt under magic or arrows. That is Elden Ring's way of shouting into your face that you need to use different weapons. There's also a horse. Best of all, you can do most things from horseback, which many other games don't really get. Because yes, it's less immersive, but to get down from the horse every time you want to pick up something in other games makes me ignore them outright. You can also fight from horseback, with a strong attack that charges up and small attacks that behave mostly like normal attacks. Of course also range. The combat changes a lot because you cannot dodge. It feels a lot like Mountain Blade. You need to estimate the charge time of your weapon and its range. Also, how far is the enemy away, what does he do, and how fast is he. You attack by charging in and you often need to circle, which creates an enjoyable but different kind of combat. Let's start with problems. The first one isn't really From Software's fault, but just the reality of playstyle diversity. If you are like me, a normal human, you want to have fun with your game. From other games you can gauge your interests and preferences, but Elden Ring is something new and you might not know what is fun. Magic, melee, or throwing items. Also some bosses react differently. The best way to show this is with the Swamp Wyvern. I fought this oversized lizard a couple of times. I tried magic, which doesn't even work, and running into it by foot. I had the worst of times with the boss that way. It always flies so far away and you have to run towards it. And dodging the fire is sometimes not possible on foot. Then I changed to the horse and had a really good time. This boss is best fought on horseback. You can evade most of his attacks, you go in and out fast and learn when to attack and when to retreat. The problem in this is you need to find the right playstyle for yourself and the boss, which is hard. And you might not notice that what you do is less optimal. If I was more hard-headed and fought a wyvern on foot dozens of times, I would get very frustrated. For my preferred playstyle, this happened. At one point I found myself in a way too strong area and I fought with everything I had. Magic, items, your mom, everything. And that was the most fun for me. Trying to cheese out way too strong enemies, separate groups and fight them one-on-one, or use the terrain for my advantage. A more real problem is enemy difficulty and reward ratio. At some point I got into the aforementioned area that is infested with the rot. There are some enemies that reward more than 1,000 runes and are easy, I mean really easy. It takes you only a few hits. Then back in the area I'm supposed to be, there are enemies that take more than triple the damage and deal the same, but only reward around 200 runes. Despite what many say that the combat and challenge is the real reward, I think that a progression reward is still important. Because for the game, progression is important, the player will adapt to it and adjust his own perspective to the game. After I got a taste of those juicy runes, I felt cheated on normal enemies. Why do I struggle with these enemies if I can just kill another, more rewarding enemy faster? I think in all of the games From Software made, Elden Ring does this the worst way. Stronger enemies reward way too few souls and some easier enemies way too much. Another small problem. If you play online, and why shouldn't you, it's part of the game, you often have messages on the ground. They changed how to change the message on the D-pad, which is also how you change weapons. So I often found myself not switching to another weapon because of this. But the worst problem by far is enemy design. There are tons of flailing wild enemies where you cannot tell where to stand or how to evade. Those tentacle monsters on the beach and later in many other places feel total random. There's a trick to kill them, but reliably dodging and blocking is almost not possible. Some enemies are way too fast. The rune bear sometimes charges suddenly and hits you. I slow this down for you to better see and put a timer on it. Only a tiny time frame signals its attacks, and then he hits you. Enemies also have hitbox issues. Sometimes their hits land far off you, or it's not really clear how large their area of effect is. I will slow down those again. I want to state I only present a few enemies, but there is a far larger number of enemies that have this problem. This is the frame before damage, and this is the damage frame. I will show more examples where I explain how Elden Ring cannot be a 10 out of 10. Elden Ring has a lot of problems, so it cannot be a 10 out of 10, but it can be a masterpiece. A masterpiece is not defined or a set norm. You could call a 8 out of 10 a masterpiece. That's on your end. But when numbers are involved, I take up arms. In most cases, numbers and especially percentages are defined. You cannot go lower than 0 or higher than 100. Most people are used to economics, where you can go into depth, but that is not the case in other fields of life. If you reduce a glass of milk to 0%, you have just a glass. You cannot go into minus milk or minus matter. You could also not be minus pregnant. You cannot have more than 100% of all cheese in the world. A 10 out of 10 means 100%. It is perfect in all cases. 100% means it cannot be better. Facing reality, it's even questionable if you can conceptually call a game a 10 out of 10, because games are so complex and big. They always could be better in some way. To illustrate this, let's make two reviews. The first one is Elden Ring how it is now, with all the hitbox issues, the performance problems and the crashes. Let's give it a hypothetical 10 out of 10. Now let's fix all the problems I have showed and all you have found and make another review. What score does it have? You cannot go into 11 out of 10 if it isn't a joke. So the only score you can give it is again a 10 out of 10. What that means that in terms of score, there is no difference between the patched game and the unpatched one. You could also say it was already perfect before patching. So why bother? A score should reflect reality. That's how we should use numbers. This breaks when all those dishonest, or to make it more nice, overzealous reviewers give the games way too high scores. This is a shorter video and I hope you still liked it. Farewell.